Thank you so much, Jamie. And now it is my honor to introduce our additional 4 expert panelists, beginning with Cindy Folkers. Unfortunately, Cindy Folkers is unable to be here today. Something urgent came up, but she passes along best wishes and luckily recorded her presentation. So I'm going to be sharing my screen and playing a video of her presentation. But first, a quick introduction to Cindy Folkers. Since joining Beyond Nuclear in 2007, Cynthia Folkers has focused on the importance of protecting people from the dangers of ionizing radiation and its impacts on health and the environment from both a scientific and historical perspective. She advocates for fully protecting the health of females and early life stages in the face of uncertain health outcomes. Cynthia earned an MS in environmental science from Johns Hopkins University. And I will share my screen now and play her presentation. And someone alert me if there's any issues with the audio or the image.
Hello, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak. I am going to focus on how the current reactor fleet is associated with health impacts, particularly on children and pregnancy, and how you can employ this knowledge to assess what is a deal breaker for your community when you are considering siting an SMR. Remember, the fact is, since none of these reactors have been deployed yet, we simply don't know what their impacts will be, but we can hazard a guess based on what we already know, and I'll review that information now. There are associations between radiation exposure and various health impacts. The uranium fuel chain is represented on this slide, beginning with uranium mining and ending with irradiated waste. The SMR plan for your area is still a pressurized light water reactor similar to the larger type that is deployed today. These reactors still rely on uranium fuel rods placed in the core. They still create radioactive isotopes never before seen in nature, and there is still no good solution for storing this waste once it is irradiated and deadly. Only there will be more of this waste, and it will stay more radiotoxic longer. And since planned waste disposal sites are mostly on the land of systemically marginalized communities, using SMRs will continue to impact these communities. The uranium fuel chain has been impacting Native American communities for decades, where members have experienced increases in a number of diseases and in lingering internal contamination among both neonates and children. And this is from the uranium mine waste, which includes heavy metals and radioisotopes. So if uranium mining continues to produce fuel for a new generation of reactors, these impacts will only grow, continuing to perpetuate the environmental injustice of this energy source. Atomic bomb survivor data indicate that adult women suffer at least 50% more harm from radiation exposure than adult males, while female children suffer 10 times more harm. Natural and man-made background radiation are also associated with childhood cancers, particularly leukemia and central nervous system cancers. And you can see the disease increases from radiation exposure represented in the 2 graphs here on this slide. If background radiation exposure raises the risk of childhood cancer, it stands to reason that adding more radiation exposure from nuclear technology increases the risk further. And in fact, we have evidence of this in health data pooled by doctors Ian Fairley and Alfred Kerbline. Now, these data encompass 4 European country studies around reactors. They found a 37% increase of childhood leukemia in children under 5 years of age living within 5 kilometers, about 3 miles, from the nuclear facilities. And that wasn't really attributable to factors other than radioactivity. We do have independent studies in the U.S. showing increases as well, but we have yet to have an official U.S.-wide study exploring this connection. Dr. Fairley, one of the authors of this study, does have a hypothesis as to why we are seeing these cancer increases, and that is that exposure during pregnancy development to releases from specifically reactor refueling, where radioactive isotopes are released to the environment in spikes, can cause mutations in a developing fetus. Such purging of the reactor core is done over a very short period of time, often in order to lower occupational exposures. So the first question to raise for the siting of an SMR is, would they open the reactor to change out the fuel, releasing radioactivity to the environment? How much would it release, and how often? The second part of Dr. Fairley's hypothesis is that tritium exposure from our current reactor fleet during pregnancy could be a large factor in subsequent childhood leukemias. Tritium penetrates steel and concrete, and it drifts off like fog in a continual manner, in addition to any spikes in radioactive releases during refueling. So this table here is of tritium gaseous releases from PWRs in 2019, but tritium is also released in water. So question 2 would be, does the SMR produce and release tritium? NewScale, the company proposing the SMR for your community, is attempting to establish, and NRC seems to be responsive to, no mandatory evacuation zone outside the fence line of the facilities. No organized evacuation is bad enough during a radiological catastrophe, but in addition, NRC would risk health by relying on EPA's quote-unquote protective action guidelines, where they could allow as many as 1 in every 6 people exposed to get a cancer over 70 years of life. But even without a meltdown or other catastrophic radiological release, no EPZ could also mean that they would consider deploying these reactors in any population center that has enough space to accommodate even the smallest size pack or module of reactors, ensuring that people living closest to this facility will collect the largest doses during any routine or refueling releases. On this graphic of radionuclide uptake in the pregnant body, I want to point out that the fetus collects nearly every radionuclide on this list. Here's the fetus. And I want you to note that radioactive carbon and radioactive hydrogen, called tritium, can collect in fetal tissue at twice the concentration as they do in maternal tissue. And this isn't surprising, since these are basic building blocks of the human body. Now, the carbon-14 is being released from currently operating reactors. It isn't measured, though. It's merely estimated. And I want to emphasize this point. We can only judge what the health impacts of an SMR might be by extrapolating from what we know today. And we certainly shouldn't repeat the mistake of ignoring health impacts from normally operating reactors in order to do this. So based on what we do know about the current reactor fleet, and the scant and it seems ever evolving information from NewScale about its reactor design, your community might want to consider the following: the systemic environmental injustice that SMRs offer, along with the necessary releases of radioactivity to the environment and the risk that they pose, in particular to women, children, and pregnancy. The lack of an evacuation zone and the danger that poses, both during what would be a radiological catastrophe, but also during normal reactor operations. Here's a list of resources that I've used to create this presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right, so I want to offer a huge amount of gratitude to Cindy for putting together such an incredible presentation. Unfortunately, you will not be able to ask her questions because she's not able to attend today. But if you have questions for Cindy on her presentation, I can follow up with her in an email, and it is possible that she could follow up and answer some of these questions via email.